Nahre Sol, also known as Alice Hwang, is a YouTuber, pianist, and composer. She studied at Juliard and the Glenn Gould School, and she makes content not dissimilar to my own, teaching various techniques and tips for the piano. But how good is she actually at the piano? Well, judging by her resume, pretty good. But today, I'm going to listen to her playing for the first time and find out. So let's get into it. So this is a really interesting pattern that she's playing, because the rhythm of the left hand that she's playing, which I think is something like this, it has 6 beats in the bar, but it's slightly syncopated, which means off the beat, and that makes it much harder to improvise around. So you get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's a really interesting rhythm. It almost feels like it has a weird number of beats in the bar, like there's 5 or 7 beats in the bar, but it is actually 6. Yeah, although that sounds incredibly hard, I think it's probably actually harder than it sounds to play. Especially where you've got loads of notes from a scale, or where you're playing thirds like that. It's incredibly difficult, and this is one of those situations where you kind of really do need hand independence. You need one of your hands to kind of be going automatically so that you can talk and play it at the same time, for example. If you can do that and get that hand to go automatically while not really having to think about it, then you can apply more concentration to that right hand. Normally, in pieces of music, you get one thing at a time that is difficult, and you can usually treat it so that it's one thing if you think vertically. So you think about where the notes in the hands line up. But if you are improvising, you can't really do that. So if you are playing a piece where you've got 2 complicated things or complicated rhythms happening at the same time, you just have to practice the most repetitive thing over and over again until your hand does it without having to think about it. Yeah, this is actually a really interesting way of practicing arpeggios. Most people will practice arpeggios like you need them for an exam, which is where you play like that. But that can be quite boring depending on the type of learner that you are. I know a lot of people do actually find it quite soothing to sit there and play scales and arpeggios up and down, but you can make scales and arpeggios more interesting to practice if you want to, so that the arpeggios are not just simple triads. But you can also do this with kind of standard arpeggios so that they're not just boring arpeggios to play. It's also a very good way of starting to learn how to write pieces of music, because you'll find chord progressions and chord patterns that you like. So it's a very good idea. One of the hardest things to get good at when learning the piano is sight reading. And that is because there is no shortcuts with sight reading. In order to get good at it, you have to do a lot of sight reading. And the problem is, once you've read a piece of music once, if you read it again, you are no longer sight reading because you're using your memory of what you've just played. And this is why, as a beginner, it's so hard to get good at it, because if you get something like the grade 1 sight reading book, there are only 55 exercises to practice with. And this is why I wrote my beginner's sight reading exercises book, which contains 420 exercises. It starts from the absolute beginning, playing just a few notes in single hands, and it progressively gets more difficult as you go. So if you are an absolute beginner at the piano and you want to get the best start to learning how to sight read on the piano, then check out my sight reading book with the link in the description. Okay, back to the video. So Alice also did a version of Happy Birthday in the style of 10 different classical composers. I really appreciate the fact that she's putting all of the techniques and things that are used in these compositions. I'm definitely going to have to fight the urge to pause and kind of explain what each of these things is, but I'll do it for just this first bit. So a motif is kind of a musical idea, and at the start of a piece, obviously, it's the first time you're hearing that musical idea. But then musical ideas are kind of recycled throughout the piece, especially in Bach, in things like fugues. A fugue is where you get a motif, and that motif comes back on top of itself in various different voices. So typically you'll have 3 or 4 voices in a Bach fugue, and there'll be 2 voices in your right hand and 2 voices in your left hand, for example. So you'll start with just one melodic idea, which is you stating the motif, and then as that motif continues, it'll start again in a different part of your hand. Polyphonic lines. Polyphony is a type of texture, and Bach is known, especially in his preludes and fugues, for writing polyphonically. There are 3 different categories of texture. You have monophonic, which is just a single melodic line on its own. Then you have homophonic, which is chords and a melody, so usually an accompaniment with a melodic line. And then you have polyphonic, or polyphony, which is where you have interweaving melodies, and this is exactly what's happening here. So a sequence is where you play one idea, but then it descends or ascends in patterns. So you might have something like, that might be your musical idea, then you would go, and that would be playing it sequentially. And then suspensions is where you have a note that doesn't belong to a chord, that falls to a note that does belong to a chord. So if I play a C chord, which is the notes C, E, and G, a suspension might be an F falling to an E, because that is a note that doesn't belong to the chord, falling to a note that does belong to the chord. And Bach will often do this in order to kind of add some tension and then release. So doing that sequentially will sound something like that. And then ornaments are decoration that don't affect the main notes within a melody. So instead of having a C, you might have a trill on a C, for example, which would be an ornament. Or you might have a mordant, or you might have a turn. All of these are types of ornaments because the main melody note is a C, but the extra notes that are kind of used around it are decoration. So I will stop stopping now. But in Bach pieces, often you'll get quite frequent modulations, which means the key that you start in, the scale that you use at the start of the piece, does not remain the scale that you use for quite a lot of the piece. You'll move to different scales. And each major scale, C major being an example, which is C, D, E, F, G, A, and B, each major scale has a relative minor, which you can find 3 half steps down. So from C, that would be A. So A minor is the relative minor of C major, and that's because they share the same notes. So an A minor scale is A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. And if a piece of music moves to the relative minor, so instead of having C as note 1 in the scale, D as note 2 in the scale, etc., then the music is going to sound slightly darker when you have note 1 being A and chord 1 being an A minor chord, for example. I mean, it's pretty impressive. It shows how much she knows Bach pieces, because obviously all of these things are put in there to try and sound like a Bach piece. And honestly, she's done a pretty incredible job. If someone played this to me and said this is a piece of Bach, I probably wouldn't think twice about agreeing with that. Now, interestingly, it says here, beginning in exposition, and this is because Beethoven is known for his piano sonatas, and piano sonatas are broken into 3 sections. There is an exposition, a development, and then a recapitulation. In the exposition, you have 2 themes, 2 ideas, and then in the development, you take those 2 themes that you had in the exposition, you break them down and maybe fragment them, so play small bits of them. You could change the key, you could turn the theme upside down, those kind of things, and then in the recapitulation, you get the 2 themes from the exposition again. So Beethoven was also known for kind of breaking away from the classical sound. He used a lot more dynamic range, so a lot more louds and softs. And he also was pushing the rules of music, whereas Bach is very, very rules-based. Although Beethoven did follow rules, he would also not be afraid of using some more obscure and interesting chords for dramatic effect. I mean, it's incredible how close to Beethoven this sounds. I am kind of struggling to hear the Happy Birthday theme, though. But if there was ever a question whether Nahre Sol is good at the piano, then I think this demonstrates that she's not just someone who plays a little bit of piano. She really does understand music. So Schumann was a little bit later than Beethoven, and to me, he's a little bit more of a softer composer, much more romantic and homophonic. So he plays a lot of chords with a melody. I'm definitely hearing more of the Happy Birthday theme in this one. I personally don't really associate Schumann with virtuosity, although obviously he's written a lot of pieces that are virtuosic. But I kind of put him in the same category as Brahms, where I think of them as more kind of stately composers. But no doubt that's just how I see those composers, and doesn't really reflect the reality. Most people that play piano aspire to play Chopin pieces because obviously he has all of the etudes, which are incredibly difficult pieces to play. There's also the waltz in A minor and the ballads that people want to play. But one key feature to Chopin pieces, which you kind of have to include if you're trying to imitate Chopin, which is that he uses quite a lot of flourishes in his music that include like an unusual amount of notes. There might be 22 notes to play in the right hand against 8 notes in your left hand, for example. And that is kind of exactly what I was talking about, that kind of flourish where there's a load of notes to fit in. I'm kind of amazed that she's composed this. It must have taken her so long to create a sound that represents Chopin. Very much like Chopin, Liszt was also a virtuosic pianist, and he used to write pieces that were very, very impressive. I'm sure both Chopin and Liszt were writing pieces just to be able to show off on the piano. But with Liszt, you're going to get a lot of these big flourishes and arpeggios, much like Chopin. So the arpeggios that she's playing there, once again, include some diminished chords, which were used in the Beethoven piece. And Liszt did write some more kind of erratic pieces like that, where you're going to get big, impressive sounds like that. So Debussy was much later. He was French, and he was part of that whole French era where you've got Fauré, Ravel, Debussy, Satie, all of those kind of French impressionist composers, and they use a lot more seventhly chords like this sound. Whereas in the Romantic period, where you have kind of late Beethoven, you have Liszt, you have Chopin, you have Schumann, you have Brahms, all of these composers that are more dramatic with their sound, and they have more authoritative or romantic pieces. In the late 1800s, early 1900s, so that French era, everything sounds much more impressionist and a bit more washy. That is a really terrible description, but I'm going with it. I think washy describes it perfectly. kind of reminded me a little bit of more later music by composers like Arvo Pärt or people like that. I think that's because Alice has prioritized the kind of quality of sound, so the big arpeggios to create that wash of sound underneath, rather than the melody. And I think for me, in French music, the melody is kind of much clearer. If you think about pieces like... there's something there that you could definitely sing, or... both of those pieces by Debussy, although they do have kind of flourishing arpeggios, there's almost something that you can latch onto that you could sing. So Eric Satie is of a similar period to Debussy, and he's also French, so he has kind of a similar quality of sound. Although he did make a lot of shorter pieces that are kind of playful pieces. And he's probably actually most famous for Gymnopédie, which I think Alice has taken a lot of inspiration from for this piece, because it does have that kind of... yeah, it's super interesting. She's so easily able to capture the sound of a composer, and it's a really hard thing to do. So Ratmanov was a little bit later, so he was definitely in the 20th century for most of his compositions. But he was also Russian, and Russian composers were once again known for having kind of a big expansive dynamic range, so you get some really loud moments and some really quiet moments. And they're kind of the opposite of the French sound. It's once again kind of authoritative and very Soviet sounding. I'm hearing some kind of Tchaikovsky influence in there as well, even though Tchaikovsky was a much more tame composer. Tchaikovsky has those kind of chordal repetitions in his first piano concerto. But there are also lots of composers who did that, including Ratmanov. But it just reminded me of that piece, and obviously Tchaikovsky is Russian as well. Wow. She's gone for John Cage as well. So John Cage is the famous composer of the piece 433, which is 4 minutes 33 of absolute silence. But he was also known for something called the prepared piano, where, like this, you put things inside the piano to change the quality of sound of the strings. It would have been very interesting to hear her do a silent version of Happy Birthday, but using the prepared piano is a very John Cage thing to do. It's super interesting. Steve Reich was and is, I believe he's still alive, a kind of minimalist technology kind of guy. Along with John Cage, this is all now kind of 20th century experimental music, and I think if anything gives away the fact that Alice is a very good pianist, it's the way she's programmed this video. Because she's gone from Bach, who is the father of rules within music, all the way through the time periods where music is slowly getting dismantled, to the 20th century, where it's all very experimental. And the fact that Alice knows all of these periods of music so intimately that she is able to reproduce those composers' sound is pretty incredible. And obviously one thing she doesn't struggle with is technique. If you want to see my reaction to one of my subscribers playing Debussy's Arabesque No. 1, then head on through and I will see you there.